fall asleep on a winter night in the Middle Ages? Most likely not, and now you will understand why.
Go back to sleep.
We are used to the idea that a comfortable night's sleep is something that everyone can enjoy. Central heating, soft mattresses, and complete silence outside our windows have become the norm for us. We fall asleep confident that we will wake up warm and safe. But what if we were to travel back several centuries to the heart of the Middle Ages? Imagine a long, bitterly cold winter night in a peasant's house somewhere in Europe. There is no glass in the windows, no radiators, and the only source of heat is a smoky hearth in the center of the room. In such conditions, sleep ceases to be a simple rest and becomes a real test, a struggle for survival. It was an era when the night belonged to cold and darkness, and the morning was not guaranteed to anyone. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how ordinary straw could save lives, and why waking up in the middle of the night was considered the absolute norm. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of medieval survival. Winter nights in the Middle Ages were not just a cold time of day. They were a state that completely changed the social structure and behavior of people. With the onset of darkness, the world outside the walls of the house became alien and hostile, forcing people to huddle together. The main principle of survival was not individual comfort, but collective heat conservation. The entire life of a family, and sometimes several families, was concentrated in a single room. It was a space where personal boundaries were erased, and everyone became part of a single warming organism. People slept together, not separated by age or gender in the way we understand it today. A shared bed, or simply a large pile of straw on the floor, was not a sign of poverty, but a well-thought-out strategy. Human bodies gathered together under one blanket generated and retained precious heat. This shaped a completely different attitude towards personal space, which in fact did not exist. The constant presence of other people was not a burden, but a guarantee of safety. Loneliness on a winter night was tantamount to a death sentence. Therefore, sleep was not a solitary process, but a social event. People fell asleep to the sound of conversations, children crying, and neighbors snoring. This cacophony of sounds was the soundtrack of survival, proof that everything was in place and everything was fine. Psychologically, darkness and cold weighed on the mind, giving rise to superstitions and fears. But it was community that helped to cope with them. Storytelling by the fire was not just entertainment, but a way to pass the long, dark hours and strengthen the spirit. The entire architecture of thinking was aimed at unity. People shared not only shelter and warmth, but also breath, smells, and dreams. This experience, completely alien to modern man, was the basis of their resilience. Such close cohabitation required a high level of tolerance and mutual understanding. Conflicts, of course, did occur, but the need to survive together was stronger than any differences. The common enemy in the form of cold weather made people allies. It is this social aspect that is often overlooked when we talk about medieval life. Survival was ensured not so much by technology as by strong social ties. The warmth of human relationships was no less important than the warmth of fire. I'm very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this collective way of survival, and could you adapt to the lack of personal space? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Are you ready to learn the shocking truth about what a typical medieval commoner's house was really like? Forget the romanticized images of majestic stone castles from movies. For the vast majority of the population, housing was a simple and purely functional shelter from the elements, without any frills. The main building materials were wood from the forest, clay from the ground, and straw from the fields. Things that could be found literally underfoot for free or almost free. Luxury was out of reach. Survival required using what nature provided in the surrounding area without trade or transportation. The walls of a typical peasant house were most often a woven frame of flexible willow or hazel branches, thickly coated on both sides with a thick layer of a mixture of clay, animal manure, and chopped straw for binding. This construction technique, known as masanka in Russia or Fachwerk in Germany, was cheap in materials and quick to execute. A house could be built in a matter of weeks. However, these thin walls did not retain precious heat well and constantly required repairs due to cracks and crumbling. The clay cracked in the frost, requiring annual renewal of the coating. The house was a living organism that needed constant care, otherwise it would fall into disrepair over the years. The roof of the house was usually covered with a thick layer of cereal straw or reeds from the marshes, half a meter thick. This natural material was a good natural insulator against cold and rain, but over time it inevitably began to rot from moisture and leak, allowing rain to get inside. In addition, dry straw roofs inevitably attracted rodents and insects, which created additional problems with noise and parasites. The roof had to be replaced every 10-15 years, which required significant labor and materials that the peasant had to plan in advance. Windows with glass were a real luxury and were completely absent in most poor houses. Instead, there were small palm-sized openings in the walls for minimal light and ventilation, which were tightly plugged with rags, straw, or closed with wooden shutters from the outside on cold nights. An icy, piercing wind constantly penetrated through these cracks and gaps, creating drafts. Light or heat, you had to choose one or the other. It was impossible to have both at the same time without glass, which was more expensive than gold for a peasant. The floors in peasant houses were universally earthen without covering, at best compacted adobe for strength. They were constantly cold and damp from the ground below, so they had to be covered with a thick layer of straw or dry grass for insulation and softness. This bedding was crucial for keeping feet warm, but it had to be replaced regularly once a month due to dirt and compaction. The floor was a living, changing element of the house, not a static surface. It rotted, absorbed dirt, and needed to be replaced as a consumable material. The layout of a peasant house was extremely simple and utilitarian. Most often, it was a single large room measuring 20-30 square meters, where people lived, ate, slept, and worked at the same time. There were no partitions or separate isolated bedrooms. The concept of privacy simply did not exist. Everything took place in one space under one roof. Life was public even within the family, and there were no secrets in such cramped conditions. In the more affluent homes of wealthy peasants or townspeople, there might have been separate stone elements of the structure, a foundation or a hearth, but even stone was not a panacea for the cold. It took a long time to heat up from the fire and cooled down just as slowly at night, and without a constant, powerful source of fire, the stone walls quickly became icy radiators of cold. In addition, the masonry often had gaps between the stones due to poor quality mortar, through which destructive drafts could easily penetrate. Stone was stronger than wood, but not warmer. It accumulated the temperature of the environment, whether hot or cold. The main chronic problem of any medieval dwelling was the ubiquitous drafts from the gaps. Airtightness was not a priority or even a concept in construction at that time, so cold air seeped in from everywhere, from the walls, roof, floor, and windows. Combating drafts by sealing them was one of the main constant concerns and activities during the winter months in order to survive. Every crack found was plugged with rags, moss, clay, whatever material was at hand when the heat leak was discovered. The entire structure of the house was designed with a single purpose in mind: to retain at least some of the precious heat from the central hearth or stove inside. Every detail, from the deliberately low ceilings to the small openings instead of windows, consciously served this task of preserving heat. The house was not so much a comfortable dwelling for convenience as it was a refuge, a fortress against the winter cold and wind outside. Architecture was a function of survival, not aesthetics or comfort. Form followed the necessity to conserve heat at any cost, even at the cost of darkness and cramped quarters. It was a cramped space where survival depended directly on a constant, exhausting struggle against the elements, penetrating through fragile walls. But how exactly did people effectively combat the invisible enemy? Dampness, which was even more dangerous to health than static cold. In the next chapter, we will reveal the secrets of the centuries-old war against the pervasive and destructive dampness that rotted wood, molded food, and caused disease. What I am about to show you was even more important for survival than the direct fight against the cold itself. We often focus on air temperature, but the main invisible enemy of comfortable sleep and health in the Middle Ages was pervasive dampness and humidity. Humidity not only subjectively intensified the feeling of cold many times over, but also actively contributed to the deterioration of belongings, food, and the destruction of dwellings themselves through rot. Damp cold killed faster than dry cold at the same temperature. Water conducts heat 25 times better than air, sucking it out of the body. Constant, insidious dampness slowly rose from the damp earthen floor, penetrated the porous clay walls from outside, and condensed into droplets on the cold interior surfaces of the stone from the warm breath of people. This created an ideal breeding ground for mold, fungi, and the decay of wood and fabrics. Combating it was no less vital than constantly maintaining a fire in the hearth for warmth. Dampness was a silent killer, destroying lung health and property imperceptibly but inevitably. One of the unique and ingenious solutions to this moisture problem was the widespread use of floor coverings made from plant materials. The earthen floor was generously covered with a thick layer of fresh aromatic herbs, reeds from the marshes, or straw from the fields, tens of centimeters thick. This thick layer of organic matter acted as a natural sponge, effectively absorbing excess moisture rising from the earthen floor below and condensing above. The plants were a free moisture absorber, available to everyone in the area at no cost. Over time, under the pressure of weight, the bottom layer of this organic bedding began to slowly rot and decompose by microorganisms, releasing a small but valuable amount of biological heat from the exothermic reaction. It was a kind of primitive, warm floor of natural origin, working on the principle of slow composting of organic matter. Of course, the hygiene of such a method was extremely questionable by modern sanitary standards, but it effectively served two purposes at once. It absorbed moisture and provided heat. Practicality prevailed over cleanliness. A rotting floor was better than a cold and wet clean stone floor. The walls of dwellings also urgently needed protection from moisture penetrating from outside and condensation from inside. In the homes of wealthy townspeople or rich peasants, they were strategically draped with thick woolen fabrics or expensive tapestries around the entire perimeter. These thick fabrics created an insulating air layer between the cold, damp wall and the warm interior of the room, effectively reducing water vapor condensation and blocking drafts at the same time. The fabric was a barrier to both moisture and wind, double protection with a single means. In simple, poor homes, more affordable, inexpensive materials were used for the same purpose. The walls could be covered with coarse mats woven from straw or reeds by hand. This not only provided additional insulation for the room with an air gap, but also reliably protected the fragile clay plaster on the walls from excess moisture coming from inside from people's breath and cooking. The mat was a shield that prevented the clay from getting wet and destroyed, protecting the structure from the residents. Natural ventilation of the room also played an important, though not always recognized, role. Smoke from the constantly burning hearth, which escaped through a special opening in the roof or a pipe, created a constant, steady upward draft. According to the laws of physics, this draft removed not only acrid smoke from the enclosed space, but also excess humid, stale air, saturated with water vapor from breathing and cooking. The hearth was not only a source of heat, but also a moisture extractor, a dual function of a single element working around the clock without interruption. Even the arrangement of furniture played a thoughtful role in the ongoing battle against damp floors. Beds and benches were always placed on high wooden legs or posts to physically raise them tens of centimeters above the cold and damp floor. This was crucial in allowing air to circulate freely from below and preventing bedding from becoming damp and rotting from contact with the damp surface. Height was protection. The higher off the floor, the drier and warmer it was to sleep, with every centimeter of height adding a degree of warmth and a percentage of dryness. Clothes and bedding were never, under any circumstances, left carelessly on the damp floor overnight. They were carefully hung on special wooden poles or hooks under the ceiling, where it was much warmer and drier due to the rising hot air. The smoke from the hearth, containing natural tar and other substances, also had an additional preservative and disinfectant antibacterial effect on fabrics, preventing rot and mold. Smoking was not a side effect, but a useful property. Smoke preserved fabrics just as it preserved meat from spoilage. Thus, medieval life was full of practical solutions for controlling humidity in the home that are not obvious to modern people, but are extremely effective. People intuitively understood from generations of experience that dry cold is much easier and safer for the body to tolerate than cold, wet air of the same temperature. This constant, invisible war against insidious dampness was the key to survival and health during the long winter months of isolation and cold. What if I told you that everything you believed about fire in medieval homes is not true? The central hearth was not just a source of heat, it was the sacred center of the entire dwelling. All of family life revolved around it, from birth to death. It was an open hearth located directly on the earthen floor in the center of the room. There was no chimney above it in the modern sense. The smoke rose to the ceiling and escaped through a special opening in the roof called a smoke window. This design had its advantages. The heat from the open fires spread in all directions, evenly warming the room. In addition, the smoke that filled the space under the ceiling smoked the rafters and straw, preserving them and protecting them from insects. However, there were more disadvantages. The room was constantly smoky, and soot settled on all surfaces. A spark flying out of the hearth could easily cause a fire that would instantly destroy the wooden and straw structure. Anything that could burn was used as fuel. In wooded areas, this was firewood, the preparation of which was one of the main autumn tasks. In treeless areas, peat, dried manure, or brushwood was used. Keeping the fire going was a sacred duty. It was never allowed to go out completely, with the embers kept smoldering under a layer of ash until morning. Starting a fire from scratch with flint and steel was a laborious process. When darkness fell, the hearth became the main source of light. The flickering flames created a bizarre play of shadows on the walls. This dim light determined the rhythm of evening life. For additional lighting, they used splinters, thin, long pieces of dry wood. They were inserted into cracks in the wall or into special metal holders. Splinters burned quickly and smoked heavily, but provided enough light for small tasks. A more expensive source of light was candles made from animal fat, lard. They burned longer and produced less soot, but were not available to everyone. Wax candles were a luxury item, used only in churches and the homes of the nobility. Thus, the night in a medieval home was filled with the smell of smoke, the crackling of logs and dancing shadows. Fire was a capricious and dangerous deity that gave warmth and light, but in return demanded constant attention and caution. How safe do you think such a life was? Clothing in the Middle Ages was not so much a matter of fashion as it was a tool for survival. The main principle of winter clothing was layering. This allowed for the creation of air pockets that effectively retained body heat. The main material for clothing was wool. Sheep's wool has unique properties. It keeps you warm even when wet and repels water. The quality of wool varied greatly, from coarse cloth for the poor to fine soft fabric for the nobility. The bottom layer of clothing, which was close to the body, was usually made of linen. Linen was hygienic and absorbed sweat well. In winter, a long linen shirt was worn under a woolen tunic, which protected the skin from prickly wool and kept outer clothing clean longer. A tunic, the main part of the wardrobe, was worn over the shirt. Winter tunics were long, reaching to the knees or even the ankles, and had long sleeves. Often, two tunics were worn at once, one thinner, the other made of thicker wool. The most important element of winter clothing was a cloak or mantle. It was a large piece of thick woolen fabric, often with a hood. You could wrap yourself completely in it, protecting yourself from the wind and cold. It was essential to cover one's head. Men wore woolen or felt hats and hoods. Women covered their heads with scarves, over which they could also wear a hood. They wore leggings, which were separate stockings attached to a belt. Linen underwear could be worn underneath. Footwear consisted of simple leather shoes or boots, which were insulated by stuffing them with straw or dry moss. All clothing was very expensive and was carefully preserved. The average peasant's wardrobe consisted of 1 or 2 sets of clothes that were worn for years. They were constantly repaired, patched, and passed down from generation to generation. People went to bed without completely undressing. They only took off their outer cloaks and shoes. Sleeping at night in the same clothes they wore during the day was the absolute norm. This simple but well-thought-out system of layered clothing, made from natural materials, allowed people to work outside and sleep in cold houses. Each layer was important, and each served its own purpose in the daily battle against the cold. Are you ready to learn the shocking truth about what ordinary people actually slept on in the Middle Ages? A bed, as a separate piece of furniture with legs, was a sign of wealth and luxury that was inaccessible to most. The vast majority of poor peasants and commoners slept directly on the cold floor, on hard wooden benches, or on wide communal bunks along the walls of unfurnished huts. A bed was a privilege of the upper class, not the norm. Most people never saw a bed in their lives, falling asleep and waking up on the ground or on boards. The basis of any bed, whether it was a rich master's bed or simple straw on the floor, was a mattress, a bag with filling. It was stuffed with the most affordable, cheap material in the area. Straw from the fields, hay from grasses, or dry leaves from the forest, into a bag made of coarse fabric. Such a primitive mattress was hard and uncomfortable for the back, and required frequent replacement of the filling every few months due to settling and rotting. Straw was free, but uncomfortable. The price of affordability was the hardness and short life of the bedding. More affluent middle-class people, artisans and merchants, could afford more expensive mattresses stuffed with sheep's wool or horsehair from tails for elasticity. The height of luxury and a demonstration of wealth were considered to be feather beds, stuffed with large amounts of soft goose or swan down. They were incredibly warm, soft and light at the same time, but cost a fortune. A peasant's annual income might not be enough to buy a single feather bed. Down was more expensive than gold by weight for the poor, an unattainable dream of softness and warmth. A sheet of coarse, homespun linen was spread over the mattress for hygiene and to protect the filling. Pillows were also a rarity and a luxury for most of the population. Instead, a hard log, a roll of straw, or simply a roll of daytime clothes, whatever was at hand, was placed under the head for support. Neck comfort was secondary. The main thing was to raise the head off the floor and out of the draft, at least a little. The main salvation from the deadly night cold was blankets, not mattresses. They were handmade from thick, felted sheep's wool, which retained heat even when wet. People often covered themselves with several layers of blankets, creating a heavy but warm protective cocoon over their bodies. The weight of the blanket was an advantage, not a disadvantage. The weight pressed against the body, preventing cold air from entering and creating a sealed thermal cocoon. The beds of the nobility and wealthy townspeople were complex, massive wooden structures, works of furniture art. They were heavy wooden frames with high-carved headboards and footboards, often decorated with carvings for beauty. But their main functional element for warmth was the fabric canopy, not the decor. Beauty served the practical purpose of retaining heat. The canopy, made of thick fabric or leather, surrounded the bed on all four sides with a curtain, creating a small, insulated room within a room or capsule. It effectively protected sleepers from chilling drafts from all directions and kept the warmth of their breath and bodies inside the enclosed space. At night, the air temperature inside such a closed canopy was several critical degrees higher than in the rest of the cold room outside. The canopy was a personal greenhouse for the body, a microclimate created by the sleeper themselves. The warm air they exhaled remained inside, heating the space naturally. Sometimes the beds were built into the thickness of the walls, resembling a closed wardrobe or a deep alcove niche with doors. Such a stationary structure also provided excellent protection from the cold, with the massive walls on three sides. In some regions of Northern Europe, Brittany and the Netherlands, box beds with sliding wooden doors at the front, completely covering the sleeper, were widespread. Sleeping in such a box was like sleeping in a chest, cramped but warm and safe from drafts. Regardless of the specific design and materials, the bed or its equivalent was the center of the family's nightlife. The whole family slept together in it, parents and small children without separation. It was the warmest and safest corner in the whole cold house, the heart of the home. The bed was not a piece of furniture, but a refuge, an island of warmth in an ocean of cold, where the family united for survival every night. Thus, the medieval bed was not a place for comfort and relaxation, but a functional device for surviving the night. Its main and only task was to isolate the sleeping person from the cold and hostile environment around them by any means necessary. In the next chapter, you will learn what specific foods and drinks help people survive the harsh winter from the inside by warming the body. The winter diet in the Middle Ages was extremely limited in variety, but deliberately high in calories for survival. It consisted entirely of a limited set of foods that could be harvested and reliably stored from the bountiful summer and generous autumn until spring. Whether a family would survive the harsh winter alive or die of starvation before the spring harvest depended directly on the fullness of their bins and barns. Supplies were the difference between life and death. Insufficient preparation meant a slow death from exhaustion in February-March, when supplies ran out and there were still months to go before the new harvest. The basis of the daily diet was grain crops: rye, wheat, barley, and oats. Bread made from coarsely ground rye or barley flour with bran was on the table every day, sometimes as the only food. Whole grains were also used to make thick, filling soups and porridges with water or milk, which provided a long-lasting feeling of satiety and warmed the body from within. Grain was the currency of survival. A sack of grain meant a month of life, and its presence or absence determined the fate of a family for the entire winter. The second most important product was animal meat, but it was rarely eaten fresh in winter because it could not be stored. The main methods of preservation and storage were salting in large quantities of salt and drying in the wind. Pork, salted in wooden barrels with brine, could be safely stored throughout the long winter without spoiling, providing protein and fat. Salt was a preservative of life. Without salt, meat rotted in a matter of days, but with salt it could be stored for months, which is why salt was valued as highly as gold and was a strategic resource. Vegetables also played an important role in the diet for vitamins, but their winter selection was very limited. Cabbage was fermented in barrels with salt for long-term storage, turning it into a sour snack. Turnips and carrots were stored in cool earthen cellars in moist sand to keep them fresh. Onions and garlic not only added flavor and pungency to bland, monotonous meals, but were also considered important preventative measures against disease and colds thanks to their phytoncides. Vegetables were survival vitamins, preventing scurvy and other deficiency diseases. Legumes, peas, beans, lentils, and broad beans were a valuable and affordable source of plant protein for the poor. When dried, they could be stored for a very long time, for years without spoiling. A thick, hearty soup made from boiled lentils or peas with bread was a typical everyday winter dish for peasants. Beans were the meat of the poor, cheap protein available to everyone when real meat was a luxury for holidays. Dairy products were in short supply and a luxury in winter, as cows and goats produced little or no milk in the cold. However, hard cheese and butter, prepared in large quantities in the summer, were an important source of fat and calories for energy. Fat was necessary to maintain energy and generate heat in the body during the cold season. Without fat, the body quickly became exhausted and froze, lacking fuel for the internal furnace of metabolism. The main warming drink for all classes was homemade beer or ale, not water. It was thick, cloudy, nutritious, and less alcoholic than modern beer, 2 to 3%. Absolutely everyone drank it, from young to old, without exception, as it was much safer than raw water from wells, which was contaminated with bacteria. Fermentation killed pathogens, making beer safe. Beer was liquid bread, a source of calories and hydration at the same time, which did not cause dysentery, unlike water. In wealthy homes, the nobility could afford the luxury of hot spiced wine, mulled wine or hippocras, exotic spices, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, nutmeg, were incredibly expensive imports that cost a fortune. Not only did they significantly improve the taste of sour wine, but they were also considered to have warming and healing properties according to medieval medicine. Spices were a symbol of wealth and power. a pinch of pepper cost a day's wages, demonstrating the status of the owner. Meals were always eaten by a burning hearth, which simultaneously warmed the diners and the hot food itself, preventing it from cooling down. Hot, fatty, and thick food was physiologically necessary for the production of internal metabolic energy and heat, which helped the body actively resist the external cold. It was a pure survival diet, simple in composition and maximally effective for preserving body heat. Calories were fuel for the body's internal furnace, without which a person would freeze from the inside. Every meal was important for maintaining strength. Every crumb of bread was literally counted and not thrown away. Winter was a time of severe austerity and strict mathematical calculation of supplies. The life of the entire family until spring depended directly on the correct and rational management of limited supplies. Overeating at the beginning of winter meant starving at the end. Undereating meant weakening and freezing, and balance was critical for everyone's survival. Long winter evenings in the Middle Ages were a time of almost complete darkness and silence. The dim flickering light from a weak hearth or smoky torch made it impossible to do complex, precise work that required good eyesight. This dark time of day required a carefully thought-out routine and well-established habits to adapt. Darkness dictated the rhythm of life, rather than people choosing it. The absence of artificial light was a tyrant that subjugated all life from dawn to dusk. A peasant's working day depended entirely on natural daylight, without exception. They rose with the first rays of dawn and went to bed shortly after sunset, when it became impossible to work. Trying to work in pitch darkness was extremely inefficient in terms of productivity and dangerous to health due to the risk of injury. The sun was the master of time, not the clock. Its position determined what to do: work, eat, or sleep, with no choice or alternatives. The evening hours after sunset were devoted only to simple, monotonous activities that did not require good, clear lighting to perform. Men could repair simple tools by touch or mechanically weave ropes from familiar fibers. Women continued to engage in monotonous spinning on a spindle or darning holy clothes, relying more on the touch of their fingers and muscle memory than on poor vision in the dark. Hands saw better than eyes in the dark. Tactile skills replaced visual ones, allowing work to continue without light. Oral communication between people played a huge, underestimated role. The family, huddled together in the darkness around a dim fire, spent the evening talking to each other. This was a precious time for telling stories, legends, fairy tales, and family traditions by word of mouth. Darkness was conducive to words. When faces cannot be seen, the voice becomes the main thing, and stories come to life in the imagination, undistracted by visual stimuli. This practice of oral storytelling was not simply a way to pass the time. It was a vital mechanism for transmitting knowledge, skills, traditions, and cultural codes from generation to generation. It was during these dark winter evenings by the fire that the rich oral culture of the Middle Ages was formed. Epics, ballads, and legends. Memory was a library, and the storyteller was a book that could be opened and read aloud to everyone in the dark. An interesting and little-known feature of sleep in that pre-industrial era was the so-called double sleep, or segmented sleep. People went to bed shortly after sunset, around 9 p.m., and slept for the first 3 to 4 hours until midnight or 1 a.m. Then they would naturally wake up in the middle of the night for an hour or two to stay awake, which was not considered a problem. Sleep was not a monolithic block, but two separate phases with a break: first sleep and second sleep, with an interval of wakefulness between them. This period of nighttime wakefulness, known in sources as night watch or vigil, was considered completely normal and natural for everyone. It was consciously used for quiet reflection on life, silent prayer to God, or quiet, intimate conversation with one's spouse in the darkness of the bed. After this productive break, people went back to bed and slept for a second period until dawn in the morning. Nighttime wakefulness was not insomnia, but a planned break, part of a normal rest cycle. This ancient model of biphasic sleep was dictated by the natural circadian rhythms of the human body, which were not disturbed by artificial lighting from kerosene and electricity. It completely disappeared from practice only with the widespread use of street gas and home lanterns in the modern era of the 19th century. For medieval people, waking up in the middle of the night was not a sleep disorder or insomnia requiring treatment, but a natural norm of life to which everyone was accustomed from childhood. Continuous 8-hour sleep is a modern invention of the industrial age, not a biological norm for humans. Thus, the dark hours of the day were not dead or lost time without activity. They were filled with their own special measured life, communication, handicrafts, reflection. It was a time for physical rest, socializing with loved ones, and immersion in the inner spiritual world without external distractions. Darkness created intimacy and focus that were impossible in the light of day with its hustle and bustle. People knew how to live in harmony with the natural daily rhythm of day and night, submitting to it. Darkness was not an enemy to be defeated by light, but merely another natural state of the world to which one had to adapt wisely without struggle. This psychological adaptation to darkness and acceptance of it was the key to psychological survival and sanity during long, isolated winters without entertainment. Acceptance of the inevitable was a form of wisdom that distinguished survivors from those broken by winter depression. Winter radically changed the nature of peasant labor. Agricultural work in the fields ceased completely. However, this did not mean that it was time for idleness. Work simply moved indoors. For men, winter was a time for repairs. Plows had to be repaired, tools sharpened, and carts prepared for spring work. This monotonous work in a cold barn or right in the house took up most of the daylight hours. Winter was also a time for crafts. Those who had the skills of a carpenter, potter, or tanner could make items for sale. Weaving baskets, bast shoes, or making simple wooden utensils was an important source of income for the family budget. Women's work also moved indoors. The main winter work was spinning wool and flax, followed by weaving. During the long winter months, it was necessary to produce enough fabric to sew new clothes for the whole family. Caring for livestock became more labor-intensive. Animals were kept in barns, where they had to be fed hay and their stalls cleaned regularly. Often, the barn was attached directly to the house, and the animals' warmth helped to heat the dwelling. Preparing firewood was a constant concern. Even if the main supply was made in the fall, it was often not enough for the whole winter. On relatively warm days, the men went to the forest for brushwood or fallen trees. The day was strictly scheduled. They rose at dawn, milked and fed the cattle in the morning, and had a quick breakfast. Then they did their main work until it was too dark to continue. With the onset of twilight, active work ceased. After dinner, the family had only a few hours left for communication and small tasks by the light of the hearth. Going to bed early was dictated not only by fatigue, but also by the need to save fuel and light. This winter routine was slow and monotonous. It was very different from the busy summer schedule, but it was this measured pace that allowed them to conserve their strength and resources until spring. Winter was a time of accumulation and preparation. The success of the coming agricultural year depended on how productively it was spent. It was the calm before the storm of spring field work. Winter was a time when survival alone became virtually impossible. The cold, darkness, and lack of resources forced people to interact more closely with each other. Neighborly mutual aid turned from a virtue into a necessity of life. If one family ran out of firewood or grain, they would go to their neighbors for help. They would repay the debt in the summer with labor or part of the harvest. This system of informal credit was the basis of social stability in the village. Winter evenings were a time for gathering together. Women would gather in one house to spin or weave together. This not only sped up the work, but also saved on lighting and heating. Men could also gather to discuss community affairs or repair equipment together. Such gatherings strengthened social ties and helped solve common problems. Exchanging news and rumors was an important part of village life. Winter holidays played a special role in maintaining morale. The main one was the 12-day cycle of Christmas celebrations. This was a time when all work ceased and people devoted themselves to rest and socializing. The holidays broke the monotony of winter life. They provided an occasion for abundant meals, games, and meetings with relatives from neighboring villages. It was an emotional outburst that helped to cope with accumulated fatigue. The church played a central role in the life of the Winter community. Sunday services were not only a religious ritual, but also the main social event. Here, people met, learned the news, and felt part of something bigger. Winter weddings were also an important event. They were often held after the harvest, when there was plenty of food and free time. A wedding was a celebration for the whole village, strengthening the bonds between families. Thus, winter did not separate people, but rather brought them together. It forced them to be more tolerant, responsive, and dependent on each other. It was the strength of the community that was the main secret to survival in the darkest and coldest times. The sense of solidarity, the knowledge that you would be helped in difficult times, gave people the strength to endure any hardship. Individualism was a luxury that medieval winter did not forgive. Survival was only possible together. We have taken a journey into the past, into the cold and dark night of the Middle Ages. We have seen that sleep in that era was not rest, but a whole science of survival, consisting of hundreds of little things, from the correct laying of straw on the floor to the ability to sleep with one eye open, listening to the breathing of the cooling hearth. It becomes clear that our ancestors possessed incredible resilience and ingenuity. They knew how to create warmth out of nothing, find comfort amid smoke and drafts, and preserve human dignity in the harshest conditions. Their experience is a hymn to the strength of the human spirit and its ability to adapt to any challenge. Which of the medieval survival practices described above did you find most interesting or surprising? Suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new explorations of the mysteries of the past.
Now, little flame.